So hello people, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be looking at Moses. I'm going to be looking at the Exodus, and we think we've got the day figured out, the day they actually left Egypt. And there's a number of dates that are out there that theologians have suggested. And I started with those dates and dialed in Stellarium to find signs in the heavens that would suggest a catastrophic event in the land of Egypt. Now, one of the main reasons I did this is because it's cool. And the second thing is we'll find out that if this is the correct date, then the first Passover was in May, which is usually about a month after the Passovers that the Jewish community has observed since coming out of Babylon. And these are one of the things that I contend is that they're on the wrong calendar, and this would be a proof text to support that theory. But I got to show you how it's done, and I've covered this before in a YouTube here about a year or two back, but it's worth going over again because just the repetition of going through this over and over again kind of breaks down the old traditions, which is the main element that's in the way of finding out the truth of God, and that's tradition. But the Passover that the Jewish community has observed is usually found in March or April, when I contend it's in April or May, depending upon the harvest of the ripe barley grain. And this year, for 2024, both the Hebrew observation is in late April, and my calculation puts it in late April, just a few days later. So they do overlap, and they overlap with the crucifixion of Christ. I believe that they were at the same blood moon that was during the crucifixion, passion, and the ministry of Christ. But since this all started with Moses, I'll show you how I came to the theory of the day that I came up with, that was the Exodus of Moses and the children of Israel. So what I did is I looked at all the dates that the more popular theologians and ministers set as a time on or about the time of the Exodus, and that was 1250 BC. From there, I looked for blood moon tetrads, both 50 years before that 1250 BC date and 50 years after. I only found one, and I'll throw it up on the screen for you here. It was on or about the year 1262 BC, just about a dozen years off that 1250 date. But the real reason why I think that this is the actual day and date of the Exodus is because of the condition of the moon. This is one of the largest full moons in recorded history, if you're looking at it from a Stellarium standpoint. I've been looking at a lot of full moons these last few years, and this one is just humongous. And it's also a blood moon. But even more so, taken from a perspective of, say, Egypt, that moon started to turn to blood at midnight and went till 3, 4 in the morning. So it was one of the largest blood moons in Stellarium history. And I'm thinking God was sending a message, and this is what he used to send that message to Egypt, that a blood moon meant blood. And this is when the firstborn of everyone in Egypt succumbed to the angel of death, for those that did not have the blood of the Lamb over their doorposts. Talk about visual effects. And not only that, but 2 weeks before that, when you have a fully waned dead moon followed by a new moon, well, that happened to produce a solar eclipse. And that solar eclipse was seen by those in Egypt at high noon. So if we are to believe in Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about the lights in the heavens, being the sun and the moon, are for signs and wonders, well, Egypt got their signs and wonders. And these signs and wonders were surrounded by extreme plagues. Plagues that wiped out Egypt as a major world power. Plagues that forced Pharaoh to capitulate and allow the children of Israel to exodus. So I'll put up on the screen the Stellarium rendering of that full blood moon, which occurred according to the date calculator in Stellarium on May 10th, 1262 BC. If you look at the distance of the moon, it's like 350,000 kilometers, which is just really close to the Earth. Normally, the moon will be around 400,000 kilometers. So it's thousands of miles closer to the Earth, so it's going to be much bigger from our perspective. And this one turns blood red because it occurs during a lunar eclipse. And again, this lunar eclipse starts at about midnight and goes into the early hours of the morning as the firstborn in Egypt are falling over dead from the angel of death that God sent as judgment. Again, this is in course with blood moon tetrads, which I contend determine when Passover and Pentecost and the other appointed times of God are determined. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years." Y'all probably heard this verse many times, but is anybody believing it? God put those signs in the heavens for signs and wonders. Well, are these signs and wonders or are they not? And if they're signs and wonders, well, signs and wonders for what? How about signs and wonders for things like Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the first month of the year, which is usually late March to April, followed by Passover, which is usually late April to early to mid-May. In other words, the appointed times of God, the festivals of God, are determined by the phase of the moon and the positioning of the sun. What I've seen so many ministers do is, well, if the Hebrew rendering of Passover happens to fall on a blood moon, well, then that's good. No, the blood moon normally determines when Passover is going to be. Passover is the day after a blood moon, after the ripe barley grain is harvested. And again, for this year, 2024, the harvest is in the first week to second week of April, and that's when the new moon is discovered on the 10th of April, a day and a half after the solar eclipse. The solar eclipse being a fully waned dead moon. We're looking for the first sliver crescent moon, and that's the first day of the month. And that would make that first day of that month, would make it Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the first month of the year. 2 weeks later, you have a full moon, and that is the day of preparation when you crucify the Lamb, and that's when Jesus was crucified. On the setting of the sun after the crucifixion, that begins the 15th of the month. That is Passover, the 12 hours of darkness in which the Passover is consumed, and that is the first day of the 7 days of unleavened bread. In the time of Moses, that's when they crucified the Lamb on that 14th day, and they put the blood on the doorposts of their dwelling places. And I wish all of you could get into Stellarium and find this out for yourself. You can just follow my lead here, but it would be great if you would do the same thing and hopefully come up with the same results. The first Passover, that blood moon, was May 10th in the month of May. You can't get that following the spring equinox as the determiner for when the month starts or when Passover begins. Now I use that same technique to find out when Christ was crucified. Again, if we are to believe Genesis chapter 1 verse 14, that the sun and the moon are used for signs and wonders, that I'm looking for a blood moon on or about the exact time Christ was crucified, sometime between 28 AD and 35 AD. So the first thing I did is I looked for blood moon tetrads, just like I did with Moses. And I'll put up the results of that. There was a couple of them, but the one in AD 32, which is just about when everybody said Christ was probably crucified, around AD 32, AD 33, there was a blood moon tetrad, and there was a blood moon on the Passover that started at high noon on the day of preparation. The day of preparation was the day that Christ was crucified. So on the other side of the earth, where it was night, you had a blood moon at 12 noon Jerusalem time. We also had a solar eclipse 2 weeks earlier. Now for Moses, the solar eclipse was in Taurus. Taurus is the golden calf. And a solar eclipse usually represents judgment to the ancient cultures. And what was judged in Egypt? The golden calf. That was the main deity, an icon for Osiris, and it was judged, and the children of Israel were judged as well for following that after God pulled them out of Egypt. If you remember Moses coming down from the hill, they were worshiping the golden calf. Well, the golden calf is Apis, and in the heavens, that constellation is Taurus, the bull. And that's where the solar eclipse was, right in the middle, right between the eyes, actually, of that constellation, Taurus. In Jesus' day, the solar eclipse was in Cetus, which is the whale, which may represent Jonah. Jonah and the whale, Jesus being 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. So there's a story being told in the heavens that we might be able to glean from these signs and wonders. And I'll put up for you the blood moon from the day I think Jesus was crucified, which appeared to be April 14th of 32 AD. And just like this year, 2024, the Passover date for the Hebrew culture and the Passover date that I believe Moses followed for that year, 32 AD, were on or about the same day. Remember, the Passover date for the Hebrew culture is usually March or April, and for what Moses followed and the children of Israel before they went into Babylon, it was April or May. Again, it's all dependent upon when the ripe barley is harvested, because you need that ripe barley for the first fruit wave offering, which is a type for Christ, Christ being the first fruits. And Christ rose from the dead on the first fruit wave offering day. So in conclusion, at looking at these two dates, I would have to say that Stellarium gives us a very accurate possibility that we got these dates correct. Again, this all depends upon leaning on Genesis 1:14, where the sun and the moon are used for signs and wonders and for seasons and times. Both the Exodus and the Crucifixion had blood moons at the time of the event. Both had solar eclipses 2 weeks before the event in question, and both solar eclipses were found in a constellation that paralleled the theme of the event in question. The solar eclipse for the Exodus was in Taurus, which is the judgment of Apis the bull, or as you know it as the golden calf. And the solar eclipse for the time of the crucifixion had the sun in Cetus, the whale of Jonah, or the fish of Jonah. And that was the sign that Christ said would be given to the Pharisees who were trying to trip him up in all these debates. He said only one sign would be given, and that's the sign of Jonah. Well, there it was, both in the heavens and in the 3 days and 3 nights that Christ was in the tomb. How that translates into today's signs and wonders will be dependent upon how the Spirit of God fulfills these dates. And as I said before, precedent has it that the times and seasons of God had a specific event on them with extreme magnitude, such as Christ's birth on the Festival of Tabernacles, his circumcision on the 8th day that was added to Tabernacles, his baptism, which I conclude was on the first day of the month next to Passover, which is Rosh Hashanah. He was chosen as a lamb sacrifice on the 10th day of that first month at his passion, crucified on the day of preparation when the lambs were sacrificed for Passover, was laid in the tomb, and was buried at Passover, rose from the dead during the festival of the 7 days of unleavened bread, specifically on the first fruit barley grain wave offering. I believe he ascended on the first day of the Festival of Weeks, and of course he sent the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. These are all prime dates of God's appointed times, and if we have the taking of the bride and the wedding banquet, they could very well be scheduled for one of these appointed times. That would follow precedence. It's just that nobody knows which particular appointed time is going to be assigned to the events that are yet to be fulfilled, such as the taking of the bride and the wedding banquet. I feel that knowing the proper calendar of God is critical, and there are many out there in the Christian world based on multiple different parameters, which unfortunately a lot of people follow without checking them out. If the Exodus of Moses was indeed on the 10th of May, 1262 BC, then it is effectively rendered about 3/4 of the Hebrew culture's, Hebrew society's Passover dates as being invalid. And according to the prophet Daniel, the work of the Antichrist is to change God's appointed times and seasons. I'm thinking that in the millennium, Christ is going to correct all those calendars to the original calendar that Moses followed. So it might be well worth our time and effort to discover the actual calendar that Moses followed, because that's the one that Christ will follow when he returns. So those of you who have been following or looking forward to this upcoming solar eclipse on the 8th of April, you're probably aware that there's a common theme on the path that this solar eclipse is going to take from Texas all the way up to Maine. And that is the theme of Jonah and the fish, or Jonah and the whale, with the beginning of the solar eclipse trajectory going through Jonah, Texas. And then it'll go through 7 cities called Nineveh. There's a lot of people that believe that this is going to be a significant time, and that God is giving the United States one last chance to repent for the many sins that has committed and is committing. This too can be a fulfillment of the signs and wonders in the heavens as expressed in Genesis 1:14. whereas this is going to be specific for the United States, being that the solar eclipse is traveling through the heartland of the United States. There are many videos on YouTube that engage this theory and research it. Most of them are worth listening to. I bring this up because just as the solar eclipse of the Exodus and the solar eclipse that came just before the crucifixion of Christ, they too had themes. And the one with Christ was Jonah, the sun being in the constellation Cetus, which is the whale. This will happen again on this April 8th through April 10th, adding to the parameters of the types, that being Jonah and the whale. So on April 8th, not only is this solar eclipse going to go through Jonah, Texas, and 7 cities in its path called Nineveh, the sun will also be in the constellation that represents Jonah and the whale, and that is the constellation Cetus. We just might be in play for some worldwide events around those dates of April 8th, which is the solar eclipse, and April 10th, which is Rosh Hashanah. Maranatha.